August 1926. We're looking at a world that is still nursing the incredibly deep traumatic wounds of the Great War. Across the board, European capitals are absolutely desperate to maintain this very fragile, highly complicated peace. And yet, almost out of nowhere, the entire continental balance is threatened by a bitter dispute over a single, sun-drenched port city on the coast of North Africa. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the Tangier crisis, which is honestly a complete masterclass in 1920s statecraft, geographic paranoia, and some very hidden imperial agendas.
Now, looking at this vibrant coastal town, you'd never really guess it, right? With all the peaceful strolling and everyday commerce happening on these paving stones, it just looks like a normal city. But behind the scenes, European diplomats were quietly panicking. The highest levels of government were literally losing sleep over who controlled this specific patch of dirt. Because beneath the surface, Tangier was a geopolitical powder keg with a lit fuse. So how exactly did one small city at the very edge of Africa threaten to tear apart the entire post-World War I world order?
Well, to understand why, we've got to zoom out a bit and look at the macro geography of the Strait of Gibraltar. Known since antiquity as the Pillars of Hercules, this is the ultimate maritime bottleneck. You've got the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean being forced through this tiny, incredibly vulnerable keyhole into the Mediterranean Sea. And you have to remember, in an era where naval power and maritime trade basically dictated whether global empires survived or collapsed, whoever controlled this narrow strip of water effectively held the keys to the Mediterranean. Empires live and die by this choke point, and absolutely every major European power knew it.
And sitting exactly on this critical choke point was Tangier. Following the 1923 convention, it had been structured as this highly unusual, almost anomalous, international city. It was totally carved out and isolated from the surrounding Spanish protectorate of Morocco. Now, officially, on paper, it was jointly administered, totally neutral, and demilitarized. But in practice, it was an absolute bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, imagine 3 different police forces, overlapping legal codes, and competing currencies all trying to run one small port. The whole system was meticulously designed to keep everyone happy, which, of course, meant that absolutely everyone was miserable. And you know who gets caught right in the middle of this dusty diplomatic crossfire? The locals. The everyday life and commerce of the city were being actively strangled. Because Tangier was artificially separated from the rest of Morocco, Spain basically threw a wall around the city, cutting off all its natural trade routes to the interior. So the local economy was just getting hammered by massive inflation and soaring unemployment. These residents weren't just accidental victims of international red tape, they were actively being starved out as a calculated political tactic in a much larger game.
Part 1. 4 Powers, 1 City. The 1920s Mexican Standoff.
This really gets to the very core of the crisis. We've got 4 major European powers sitting down to a very dangerous diplomatic poker game, and they've all pushed their chips to the center of the table. Spain desperately wants to integrate Tangier into their surrounding protectorate. France is looking to expand its already massive influence in Morocco and basically keep Spain in check. Great Britain is absolutely demanding that the strait remain neutral to protect their vital naval assets. And Italy? Benito Mussolini is explicitly demanding recognition and a major expansion of Italian Mediterranean power. So it's this incredibly tense 4-way tug-of-war where nobody can afford to let go.
Now, out of all these players, Spain, led by their assertive strongman General Primo de Rivera, is definitely feeling the heat the most. They were bleeding resources. At this time, Spain was fighting the incredibly brutal Rif War in their surrounding Moroccan protectorate, and they were making immense economic and military sacrifices. So the very idea that Tangier, sitting smack in the middle of their zone, was this isolated, unemployed haven where political radicalism was fermenting, well, it was completely intolerable to them. They were terrified this unrest would spill over the borders and ignite the whole region they were so desperately trying to pacify.
And in 1926, the fear of communism and rebel cells was the ultimate trigger phrase to scare Western powers. Spain knew exactly what buttons they were pushing here. On August 23rd, the Spanish government finally reaches a breaking point and unleashes this visceral, highly aggressive diplomatic note. They explicitly brand Tangier an asylum for rebels, a nest of conspiracies, and a passageway for contraband of war. They painted the city as this dangerous, living cell of rebellion that directly threatened peace at the very doors of Western Europe. It was an absolute bombshell.
And Spain didn't just complain. They demanded an immediate end to all that complicated internationalization. They effectively delivered an ultimatum to the other powers, either incorporate Tangier completely into the Spanish zone or grant Spain a permanent mandate to govern it exclusively. Just think about the sheer diplomatic nerve of this move for a second. Spain, which was arguably a second-tier power at the time, was laying their cards on the table and straight up daring the massive British and French empires to call their bluff over a piece of paper.
And it is wild to see just how fast this regional spat becomes a breathless global crisis. On the 23rd, that explosive note is drafted in Madrid. Within 72 hours, Washington is frantically reading full translations relayed by U.S. Ambassador Hammond. By the 30th, the British Parliament is holding urgent, super tense debates about the demands. And Spain? They boldly propose a meeting in Geneva for September 1st to force a resolution. The ticking clock and the sheer speed of this escalation is just staggering for the normally slow-moving diplomacy of the 1920s.
Right here, we see the ultimate clash of 1920s statecraft, marked by a really fascinating contrast in tone. Spain is making these grandiose, sweeping demands, dramatically framing their aggressive takeover as somehow vital for the interests of universal peace. Britain, on the other hand, delivers an absolute masterclass in cold, polite diplomatic stonewalling. In a masterpiece of British understanding, they firmly reply that His Majesty's government could not agree to the first alternative. Spain is basically screaming for control, and Britain just calmly refuses to hand over the keys to the strait to a single foreign power.
Speaking directly in Parliament, Sir Austen Chamberlain holds the line for Britain. When pressed about Spain's urgent demand to settle this at the League of Nations in Geneva, he just coldly replies, "I do not think Geneva would be the place for this discussion." And he wasn't just protecting a treaty there, he was protecting the Royal Navy. Britain's prize naval base at Gibraltar was sitting right across the water. Chamberlain outright rejects Spain's attempt to force a rushed, public international summit, effectively slamming the brakes on Spain's momentum.
Part 2. The twist, a hidden motive, beyond the Moroccan coast. So just when you think this is purely a territorial dispute over a port city, we uncover a hidden layer in the diplomatic cables that turns this entire crisis completely on its head. Deep in the archives, we find that when U.S. Ambassador Ogden Hammond sent the Spanish ultimatum to Washington, he secretly appended a paraphrase note at the very end of his telegram. This little intelligence note suggested that Tangier wasn't actually Spain's final endgame at all. The entire crisis in North Africa, it was a smokescreen.
Yeah, Spain was utilizing the threat of taking over Tangier strictly as leverage. Their true goal lay hundreds of miles away in Switzerland. The crucial point we have to take away from this is that Spain's true objective was simply elevating their status on the global stage. They were demanding a permanent seat on the League of Nations Council, which is basically the 1920s equivalent of the UN Security Council. They figured, hey, if we create a massive geopolitical headache in North Africa, Britain and France will gladly hand over that prestigious league seat just to get us to back down.
Just think about the sheer cynicism of that tactic for a second. Spain was totally willing to destabilize North Africa, wreck a local economy, and threaten European peace, all just to secure a fancier chair at a meeting table in Geneva. The diverse residents and the struggling local merchants of Tangier were completely secondary to the empires that controlled them. They were simply collateral damage in a giant diplomatic game of chicken. An entire city's fate hung in the balance purely for the sake of imperial prestige.
As we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a really powerful thought about the world today. Global trade, the very things you and I buy every single day, still relies on this exact same geographic logic. Look at the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the South China Sea. The next time you see a global standoff over a tiny strip of land or water on the news, ask yourself, is it really about the map, or is someone just looking for a better seat at the table? Or are we just watching the secret paraphrases of today,